throwaway account for obvious reasons. I've been sitting on this for years, and every time I read other people's posts and life stories or confessions, I feel that familiar itch in my chest. So here goes. My name's William, and one of the worst, and weirdly most defining, things I ever did was steal a prototype of new technology. Corporate espionage. The kind of phrase that sounds sleek and cinematic until you realize it almost cost me my freedom. At the time, I was in my early 30s, working a job that looked impressive on paper and felt hollow in real life. I wasn't broke, I wasn't desperate in the obvious sense. That's the part that still messes with me. This wasn't about survival. It was about resentment, ego, and a growing sense that I was smarter than the people who kept telling me no. The prototype itself was something everyone in the company whispered about. Next-gen, game-changing, the kind of thing that could reshape an entire industry. I wasn't supposed to be near it, let alone involved. I watched lesser ideas get credit, saw executives posture like visionaries, and felt myself shrinking into the background. Somewhere along the line, that turned into a quiet, dangerous thought. If they don't value this, maybe someone else will. Maybe I will. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a criminal. It happened gradually, through late nights, bitter conversations, and a steady drip of self-justification. I told myself I was exposing waste. I told myself I deserved compensation for being overlooked. Mostly, I told myself I wouldn't get caught. That's the lie everything else grew out of. Once the idea took root, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt methodical. Boring, almost. That's how I knew I was in trouble. Crimes you shouldn't commit are supposed to come with alarms and flashing lights in your head. This one came with spreadsheets. I didn't call it stealing at first. I called it understanding the system. I started paying closer attention to who accessed what, when rooms were empty, how information moved inside the company. None of this required hacking or movie-style tricks, just observation. I'd been invisible for years, and it turned out invisibility was useful. Preparation, for me, was less about gadgets and more about patience. I volunteered for extra tasks. I stayed late without being asked. I built a reputation for being reliable, unthreatening. The kind of guy people trusted with doors left ajar and conversations that should have stayed private. Every small act of trust felt like a brick I could eventually pry loose. At home, I rehearsed conversations that never happened. If someone asked why I was there late, what would I say? If someone questioned my interests, how would I shrug it off? I told myself this was just contingency planning, but deep down I knew it was rehearsal. You don't practice excuses unless you're planning to need them. The strangest part was how normal my life looked from the outside. I still paid rent, still met friends for drinks, still complained about work like everyone else. Meanwhile, in the quiet spaces between those moments, I was aligning pieces in my head. Time, access, opportunity. I kept telling myself I could stop any time. I didn't stop. There's a moment before you do something irreversible where your brain tries one last time to save you. For me, it wasn't a voice screaming don't. It was a dull question. Is this really who you are? I ignored it the way you ignore a phone buzzing in another room, aware, but choosing distance. By this point, I knew more than I ever should have. Not in a technical sense, but in a human one. I knew which security guy took long smoke breaks. I knew which manager hated confrontation and which one loved sounding important. I knew when the building felt empty even if it wasn't. That kind of knowledge changes how a place feels. It stops being an office and starts being a map. I remember standing in the elevator one night, watching the floor numbers light up, and feeling this quiet, electric calm. That scared me more than fear would have. Fear would have meant I still respected the line. Calm meant I'd already stepped over it in my head. I started justifying things in advance. I'm not hurting anyone directly. This company will survive. They'll never even know it was me. Each thought stacked neatly on the next, like legal padding around a moral void. I wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. I was thinking about execution. And yet, every time someone smiled at me in the hallway or thanked me for staying late, something twisted in my stomach. Trust has weight when you're carrying it in the wrong direction. I'd nod, smile back, and feel like I was already lying, even when I hadn't done anything yet. That's the thing people don't tell you, the crime starts long before the act. By the time my hands ever touched anything they shouldn't have, the real damage, to my sense of self, was already done. The night I chose wasn't special on paper. No storm, no dramatic deadline, no cinematic countdown. That almost makes it worse. It was just a Tuesday, quiet, predictable, the kind of night no one remembers later. I told myself that was strategic. In reality, it was cowardice. I didn't want the night to stand out. I stayed late again, like I'd done dozens of times before. Same excuse, same half-hearted jokes about workload. People left in pairs, then singles, then not at all. The building shifted as it emptied, less noise, more echo. Offices feel different when they're empty. They stop being workplaces and start feeling like something borrowed. My heart didn't race the way I expected. It thumped, sure, but steadily. Too steadily. I kept thinking, this is it. This is the moment where I either turn around or keep going. And then I didn't turn around. That decision felt smaller than it should have, like stepping off a curb instead of off a cliff. Every step after that felt heavier. Not physically, emotionally. I was hyper-aware of everything, the hum of lights, the sound of my own breathing, the way my hands didn't quite feel like mine. I remember pausing at one point and laughing under my breath, not because it was funny, but because my brain didn't know what else to do with the pressure. I wasn't thinking about profit or recognition anymore. I was thinking about not being noticed. About time stretching and shrinking at the same time. About how strange it is that you can be surrounded by things you've seen 1,000 times, and suddenly they all look like witnesses. That was the moment it stopped being a plan and started being a crime. I'd imagined this part 100 times, and every version was wrong. When I finally stood in front of the prototype, it didn't look powerful or dangerous. It looked mundane. Clean casing, unlabeled, sitting there like it belonged to no one. That almost broke the spell. For half a second I thought, all this for that? And then my brain caught up and reminded me what it represented. My hands hesitated. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because touching it felt like signing my name to something permanent. I kept expecting alarms or a voice or something external to intervene. Nothing happened. The world didn't react. That silence was deafening. I moved carefully, painfully aware of every sound I made. The room felt smaller than it had any right to be, like the walls were leaning in to listen. I remember the texture of the surface under my fingers, cool, smooth, and the absurd thought that this was the most intimate moment I'd ever had with my job. That's when something unexpected happened. Doubt didn't rush in. Guilt didn't either. What I felt was focus. Pure, narrowing focus. The kind you get in emergencies or right before an accident. There was no room for philosophy, no room for regret. Just a checklist running in my head and the quiet knowledge that I was already committed. I kept thinking, don't rush. Rushing gets noticed. So I forced myself to move slowly, even though every instinct was screaming to grab it and go. Time did that weird elastic thing again, seconds stretching into minutes, minutes collapsing into nothing. When I finally stepped away, whatever line I'd crossed earlier faded into irrelevance. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was tangible. Heavy. Real. And I could feel it settling into me, like a weight I'd be carrying whether I got away with it or not. Things never go wrong the way you imagine. They go wrong sideways. I was just about to move on, mentally checking off the hardest part, when I heard footsteps. Not loud, not urgent, just present. The kind that don't belong in an empty building at that hour. My body reacted before my brain did. Every muscle locked up, and for a split second I genuinely considered just standing there, and seeing what happened, like a deer staring at headlights. My mind raced through options, none of them good. I hadn't planned for company. Not really. I'd told myself the odds were low and treated that like a guarantee. Turns out, low odds still count as odds. The footsteps stopped somewhere nearby. A door opened and closed. I couldn't see who it was, but I could hear the faint sounds of someone settling in, papers shifting, a chair scraping softly against the floor. They weren't looking for me. That almost made it worse. Accidental witnesses are unpredictable. They don't follow scripts. I stayed still longer than was reasonable, barely breathing, convinced that any movement would echo. My heart finally caught up to the situation and started pounding hard enough that I was sure it was audible. I remember thinking, this is it. This is where it all collapses. Not dramatically, just quietly, stupidly. Eventually, the sound stopped again. More footsteps, fading this time. A cough. An elevator dinged somewhere far off. The building exhaled, and only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath so long my head was light. That moment did something to me. It cracked the illusion of control I'd been clinging to. Up until then, everything had felt deliberate, almost professional. After that, it felt fragile. Like I was juggling glass and pretending it was steel. I should have taken that as my cue to walk away. I didn't. After that scare, my plan stopped being a plan and turned into a series of reactions. I hate admitting that, because I like to think of myself as calculated. Truth is, I was winging it, just with a calm face. I double-checked everything I'd already checked twice. Not because it helped, but because it gave my hands something to do besides shake. The building felt hostile now, like it knew. Every creak sounded intentional. Every light felt brighter. I kept replaying the footsteps in my head, imagining alternative endings where someone rounded the corner and caught me mid-act. I adjusted. That's what I told myself I was doing, adjusting. In reality, I was buying time for my nerves to settle. I rerouted how I was going to leave, chose paths that added distance but reduced exposure. I avoided places with cameras I'd walked past 1,000 times without thinking. Funny how quickly you learn the blind spots when you suddenly care. There was a moment where I caught my reflection in a darkened window. I didn't recognize myself at first. Same clothes, same face, but something in my eyes looked sharper. Smaller. Like I'd folded myself into a version that could do this and survive it. That scared me more than getting caught. I kept moving. Slow, deliberate, like I belonged there. That's the trick no one talks about. Confidence isn't about bravado, it's about not apologizing with your body. I matched my pace to the environment, nodded at no one, reacted to nothing. Inside, though, I was vibrating. By the time I reached the next checkpoint, one I'd mentally marked as almost safe, my adrenaline was so high it felt like clarity. That's dangerous, too. Adrenaline lies. It makes you feel capable right when you're most likely to screw up. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part wasn't behind me. It was waiting. Almost out is a psychological trap. Once you think you're past the danger, your brain starts spending relief it hasn't earned yet. I was moving toward the exit I'd settled on, one that required just enough normal behavior to blend in without looking staged. Badge swipe, short walk done. I could already feel my shoulders loosening, my thoughts drifting forward to what I'd do once I was outside. Sleep. A drink. Pretend this night never happened. That's when I noticed the guard. He wasn't new. That was the problem. If it had been someone I didn't recognize, I could have written it off as bad luck. But I knew him. Knew his posture, his routines, the way he liked to chat when he was bored. And he was bored. Leaning back, half smiling at his phone, perfectly positioned to notice anything out of the ordinary. I had a split second to decide whether to wait him out or go for it. Waiting meant lingering. Lingering meant questions. So I went for it. I swiped my badge like I'd done 1,000 times. The beep sounded too loud. I stepped forward, nodded in his direction, and said something casual, don't even remember what. Probably about working late. He looked up, actually looked at me, and for a terrifying moment his eyes narrowed just enough that I thought, this is where it ends. Then he shrugged and said something equally forgettable. That was it. No alarm. No call-out. Just human disinterest. I walked past him, every nerve screaming not to run, not to react, not to show how close I was to coming apart. My legs felt detached, like they belonged to someone braver. When the door finally closed behind me, the sound was so ordinary it felt insulting. Months of build-up, hours of tension, and it ended with a click. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. Like I'd stepped out of myself and left something behind in that building. I didn't realize yet that walking out wasn't the end of the crime. It was just the point of no return. I don't remember the drive home. That's not me being poetic. I genuinely don't remember most of it. I know I got in the car. I know I followed the same route I always did. Somewhere between the parking lot and my apartment, my brain just skipped. What I do remember is the noise inside my head. Once the immediate danger passed, everything I'd been holding back rushed in at once. My hands started shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My jaw hurt from being clenched. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting flashing lights or a familiar car behind me, even though I knew how irrational that was. Every red light felt like an accusation. Every other driver felt like a potential observer. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how suspicious normal behavior can feel when you're hiding something. I obeyed every traffic law like my life depended on it. Probably because, in a way, it did. At one point I laughed. A short, ugly sound that startled me. It wasn't joy or relief, it was release. My body didn't know how else to let the adrenaline go. Right after that came the guilt. Not the dramatic, soul-crushing kind people talk about, but a low, persistent pressure in my chest. Like I'd swallowed something I couldn't digest. When I finally got home, I sat in the car longer than necessary, engine off, hands still on the wheel. The silence felt louder than the building ever had. I kept thinking, if I go inside, this becomes real. Inside meant this wasn't just something that happened, it was something I'd done. Eventually, I went in. I locked the door behind me out of habit, then stood there, staring at it, struck by the absurd thought that a cheap deadbolt was now my line of defense against consequences far bigger than my apartment. That night I didn't sleep. I just lay there, replaying everything, waiting for the knock that never came. Morning came like it always does, rudely, without asking if you're ready. Sunlight through the blinds felt wrong, like it was exposing something. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my neighbor's alarm go off, someone laughing outside, the world continuing as if I hadn't just detonated my own sense of normal. That disconnect was jarring. I'd expected to wake up different. Branded. Instead, I just felt tired. I went through my routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, phone scrolling. Every normal action felt slightly performative, like I was auditioning for the role of guy who didn't commit a felony last night. I kept waiting for my phone to ring with an unknown number. HR, security. Anyone. Nothing. At work, I was hyper-aware of everything. The building looked the same, but it felt like a crime scene I'd wandered back into. People chatted about deadlines and meetings, blissfully unaware. A couple of them even joked with me about staying late too much. I laughed along, and it felt like my mouth was borrowing the sound from someone else. I studied faces, searching for suspicion. There was none. No sudden policy changes. No whispered conversations stopping when I walked by. The absence of reaction was almost unbearable. It made me question my own memory. Did it really happen the way I think it did? I half expected to open my email and find proof that it had all been some elaborate stress dream. But then I'd feel it, that quiet, heavy certainty in my gut. The knowledge that I was now out of sync with everyone around me. I was carrying something they weren't. Not physically anymore, but psychologically. A secret with edges. That day taught me something important. The immediate aftermath of a crime isn't chaos. It's waiting. And waiting is its own kind of punishment. It turns out you can only hold yourself together for so long before the stress starts leaking out in dumb, inconvenient ways. A few days after the theft, I messed up something trivial at work. Not related to the prototype, not even important. Just a small oversight that normally wouldn't have mattered. My manager pointed it out casually, and my reaction was completely disproportionate. My pulse spiked. My ears rang. For a split second, I was sure this was it, that the comment was a prelude to the conversation. It wasn't. But my body didn't know that. That became the pattern. Every unexpected email felt loaded. Every calendar invite looked like a trap. I started rereading messages obsessively, looking for subtext that wasn't there. I avoided eye contact in hallways, then overcorrected by being too friendly, too eager. I was acting like someone with something to hide, because I was. Outside of work, I wasn't any better. Friends noticed I was distracted, jumpy. I cancelled plans I'd normally enjoy because being around people felt risky, like I might say the wrong thing or let something slip. I started sleeping in short bursts, waking up convinced I'd heard my phone buzz or someone knocking. The worst part was the internal narration. I'd justify what I'd done in the morning, no one was hurt. It's already over. By night, that same voice would turn on me, you idiot. You ruined everything for what? I couldn't settle on a story that made me feel okay, so my brain kept trying new ones, over and over. That's when I realized something unsettling. The crime wasn't over just because the act was done. It had moved in with me. And it was starting to rearrange the furniture. About a week later, the atmosphere at work changed. Not dramatically, no alarms, no all-hands meeting, but in subtle ways that only someone already paranoid would notice. A new sign-in requirement here. A reminder about data handling there. Completely reasonable on their own. Together, they felt like the walls inching closer. I told myself it was coincidence. Companies tighten security all the time. Still, I found myself replaying every decision I'd made, every trace I might have left behind. Had I logged in somewhere I shouldn't have? Taken too long in one place? Trusted the wrong assumption. The past became a puzzle I couldn't stop resolving. Then came the conversation. A coworker, someone I genuinely liked, mentioned in passing that leadership was looking into a leak. He said it lightly, like office gossip, but my stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. I forced myself to ask a casual follow-up question, the kind that sounds curious instead of terrified. He shrugged. Didn't know details. Probably nothing, he said. Probably nothing. After that, everything felt performative. I measured my words. I monitored my tone. I avoided certain people entirely, then worried that avoidance itself looked suspicious. I even drafted imaginary confessions in my head, what I'd say if confronted, how I'd explain myself without incriminating myself further. It was exhausting, living in a constant state of conditional reality. At home, I started questioning my motives more seriously. Not the justifications I'd rehearsed, but the real ones. Pride. Spite. The desire to prove something, to who, I wasn't even sure anymore. Whatever I thought I'd gained suddenly felt abstract and distant, while the risk felt immediate and intimate. I'd wanted control. What I got instead was a life where every quiet moment echoed too loudly. The email showed up on a Thursday afternoon. Subject line, quick chat? From someone in compliance. My vision tunneled. I read it 3 times, like the words might rearrange themselves into something harmless if I stared long enough. This was it. Every rehearsal, every sleepless night, every imaginary confession condensed into a single, polite question mark. I didn't reply right away. That was my first mistake. Or maybe my first smart move. I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror like I was trying to memorize my own face. Act normal, I told myself, which is the least useful advice anyone has ever given themselves. When I finally sat down for the meeting, my mouth was dry enough that my tongue felt foreign. The compliance officer smiled. Friendly. Disarming. She talked about general procedures, about an audit, about how these things happen. From time to time. I nodded along, hard hammering, waiting for the turn. The moment where she'd say my name with a different emphasis. It never came. She asked routine questions. I gave routine answers. I kept my voice steady by focusing on stupid details, the hum of the air vent, the way her pen clicked, the pattern in the carpet. At one point she said, "This isn't about you specifically," and I almost laughed from the sheer absurdity of how much it was about me. When it ended, she thanked me for my time. That was it. No follow-up. No warning. I walked back to my desk feeling like I just stepped away from the edge of a roof without realizing how close I'd been. Relief hit hard, and then something uglier followed it. A dangerous thought. I might actually get away with this. That was the moment I understood how people get bolder, how one success rewires your risk meter. It scared me more than the email ever had. Nothing happened after that. And I think that was the punishment. Days turned into weeks. The investigation, if it ever truly existed, faded into background noise. Security stayed tighter, but no one knocked on my door. No follow-up emails. No sideways looks that meant anything. Life resumed its rhythm, and I was expected to fall back into it like nothing inside me had shifted. But I didn't bounce back. I flattened. The thrill was gone completely, burned out by prolonged stress. What replaced it wasn't relief, it was a dull, persistent unease. I'd won, technically. I hadn't been caught. And yet, every time I thought about it, my chest tightened. Getting away with it didn't feel like victory, it felt like a sentence with no end date. I started noticing changes in how I saw myself. Before, I thought of my actions as situational. I did a bad thing under specific circumstances. Now it felt more personal. Like I'd uncovered a version of myself I couldn't unsee. Someone capable of crossing lines quietly, convincingly, and living with it. That realization was unsettling in a way handcuffs never would have been. I pulled back at work. Not out of fear, but out of disillusionment. The place that once felt like a battleground now just felt small. The prototype, wherever it ended up, wasn't some shining symbol of justice or vindication. It was a reminder. A weight tied to a night I couldn't talk about. I learned that getting away with it doesn't restore who you were before. It just leaves you alone with the version of yourself who did it, and asks you to make peace with that. I don't tell this story because I think it makes me interesting or clever. I tell it because it stripped away a comforting lie I used to believe, that there's a clean line between people who do things like this and people like me. There isn't. There's just a series of small choices that don't feel dangerous until they add up to something irreversible. What did I learn? That motives matter less than momentum. I didn't wake up wanting to betray anyone. I just kept saying yes to the next rationalization. I learned that competence doesn't equal control, and that intelligence can be weaponized against your own conscience just as easily as against the system. Most of all, I learned that secrecy is corrosive. Not explosively, slowly. Quietly. From the inside out. If you're reading this and you're anywhere near the edge of something you're justifying a little too well, here's my advice: pause earlier than you think you need to. Talk to someone before you convince yourself you're alone in your thinking. And don't confuse "no one got hurt" with "nothing was lost." I lost sleep, trust in myself, and a version of my identity I can't fully get back. I didn't go to prison. I didn't have my life publicly dismantled. By most standards, I got away with it. But I carry that night with me, and I probably always will. Not as a badge of rebellion, not as a horror story, just as a reminder of how close I came to becoming someone I wouldn't recognize at all. If nothing else, let this be a warning: the most dangerous crimes aren't the ones that ruin your life overnight. They're the ones that let you keep living it, slightly altered, quietly heavier, forever.